Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. So we have interesting people and Emily Jashinsky on every month.
It's fair.
But Emily is a senior fellow with us at IWF. That is her most important of many hats. But she is also the culture editor over at The Federalist. She has a show called Counterpoints with Ryan Grimm on Breaking Points, which is Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty's show. That's very popular independent media show. I recommend you check it out. As well as many other hats, including with Young America's Foundation. She's just running around. She's just everywhere. Emily Jashinsky, thanks for coming back on once a month with me to discuss what we think was important in the last month.
Inez, you know I look forward to it every month. I get the invite in my inbox and I'm all ready to go.
Yeah, we've decided that we're just letting AI schedule. I don't even ask Emily anymore when she has time to do this. I just put it on her calendar via the magic of scheduling tools. So just allow the machines to rule your life, Emily.
True story.
So I wanted to kick it off with something that feels very weirdly retro, and that is to talk about Me Too. I thought this moment of hysteria had kind of passed, or at least ebbed away, but it turns out that it hasn't. We have this big news scandal about Russell Brand, and I guess just to kick it all off, I mean, what do you think about this? How we should deal with this? The obvious political elements. How do we, with integrity, deal with this kind of issue when we know that there's this media background and sort of political background to it? Do you think we can still objectively evaluate these kinds of cases in the public square?
Absolutely not. And I was thinking, because initially my instinct was to disagree with you. We had been talking last week on another show about Russell Brand, and I think you phrased it as the reemergence of Me Too. And my instinct was to disagree with that. And I was thinking about it today, and I was like, well, maybe my disagreement is more semantics. But at the same time, I had the thought that it's not so much the reemergence of Me Too as it is a reminder that we will always be living with Me Too now, that we've decided as a society, our standard for who gets to participate in the discourse is basically going to be adjudicated in the court of public opinion. And the United Kingdom's government pressuring Rumble to do what YouTube and Google did voluntarily, which is demonetize Russell Brand's content, is one of the most frightening and shocking things. I guess I shouldn't call it shocking, but it's still a shock to the system, even if it's not necessarily surprising. They actually wrote a letter to Rumble. Rumble replied that they're standing fast, and that's obviously smart for both a business reason. It's the one thing that distinguishes them from YouTube, basically, and a moral reason. But the letter that the UK sent was chilling, and that is an overused word, but I think completely appropriate in this case. And for me, it was just a reminder that, while cancel culture ebbs and flows, these standards are now the muscle memory of the corporate and sort of elite sector, and it's what they default to. Even though you have Jennifer Aniston coming out and saying cancel culture kind of dumb, and we have this almost comfort in the sense that free speech is sort of won out and whatever. It really, like, we developed a very unhealthy muscle memory during the sort of frenzied days of cancel culture and Me Too, and I think it's with us to stay.
Yeah, I mean, I want to explore more the tech part of this, which seems to fit nicely into what I know, Emily, you've been talking about for a long time in terms of the private arm of censorship. As an aside, I mean, a friend of mine on Twitter said, and he had this series of tweets. He's a professor, and he said one of his Belarusian grad students, one of his favorite students, she would, when she was talking to him about some of these issues, she would check behind her, like look over her left shoulder, look over her right shoulder, and then say, well, on gender stuff, you guys are a little crazy here in America. Which I think is the perfect sad commentary on where we're at, and that was possible with this private system, which we'll get to in a minute. But just to push that discussion off by a few minutes and discuss the underlying material, because so I've gotten some pushback. Like I do this podcast with Richard Hanania every week, and he was saying, well, why can't we just objectively evaluate? Why can't we read this list of charges that's put out, and why can't we just objectively evaluate whether they're serious or not, whether they're credible or not, whether there's any evidence for them or not? And I think that would have been my view sort of pre Brett Kavanaugh era. But now, even doing that, I have this very gut level reaction to being pulled into doing that, to essentially be pulled into the role of jury when we know that there's no no fairness in how the facts will be presented, and no fairness in how the targets are selected at all, right? And so I feel like I'm participating. I'm like involuntarily participating if I sit there and say, well, this charge sounds kind of bad. This one is less serious. This woman seems credible. This woman doesn't. I feel like I'm being waylaid into this kind of like sick humiliation ritual where we know why this guy was selected right now. And by the way, not 10 or 20 years ago when he was doing all of these things and getting cheered by the culture around him for doing it. Like we know why. And I can no longer separate that from the analysis of the objective facts. Like some of these charges may be true, some of them may be false, but I resent being asked to evaluate them now, because I know that by doing that and maintaining that kind of objectivity, I'm participating in the way that these targets were selected, in this like bizarre ritual we now have, that is aimed not just at celebrities and men in power, but actually often I feel like just after they lose it or they become unpopular in some way, right? Even the Harvey Weinstein thing, like I don't know much about Hollywood insiders or whatever, but some folks have written that he was definitely on his way down, that his power was very much on the downslope in terms of within the industry when they finally got him, right, for all of those things that he did over the years. It just seems like, I don't know, I resent, it seems like a kind of emotional blackmail to basically be like, well, either you objectively evaluate these or you believe all women. Those will be the two sides, but either way, you're participating, right? You are being called to participate in evaluating what Lothario Russell Brand did 20 years ago, as though there's any forum outside of court that has any fair way of adjudicating that. I don't know. I resent the whole like game that I'm supposed to play.
It's interesting because there's been this like commodification of the discourse. And I'm just thinking of this right now with Twitter. You had advertisers coming in basically to sponsor a free platform or to prop up a free platform that was reliant on basically intense and politically charged conversations taking place. And advertisers in a hypersensitive, politically correct culture. We've had radio and we've had TV, and these advertiser challenges have always come up. It was conservatives that were conservative moms, Christian moms that were protesting Dawson's Creek when it was on the air and trying to pressure advertisers not to support programming like that. I mean, the ad boycotts are not new at all, but with Twitter, it was this daily deluge of speech that started to become the epicenter of politics and culture, because it was where all of the elites and hardcore fans, most politically active, most active in pop culture spaces, Beyonce's fans, the Bayhive, Taylor Swift fans, they were all on these platforms that were free, but sponsored by advertisers. And we thought political correctness was like defeated in the 90s, and it just wasn't. And you can't really have that combination of things. We've even seen it become a problem. There's no doubt in my mind that was weighing heavily on Fox News and Rupert Murdoch in the Tucker Carlson decision, because there were a lot of advertisers, despite how high his numbers were, that just didn't want to be facing the backlash from all of the leftist groups that were organizing boycotts to pressure those advertisers to were getting big visibility for big money for their products on Tucker's show, not to have any part of it. So it's this weird era where you have what Palia wrote about in the Hollywood Reporter in the middle of Me Too. She wrote that this idea that an artist has to be a good person is, quote, a sentimental canard of Victorian moralism, which is a perfect Palyaism. It might be my favorite Palyaism. A sentimental canard of Victorian moralism combined with this emergence of platforms, free speech platforms, sponsored entirely by advertisers. And that is an impossible combination. When you have those two things together, and it's so sad, and it makes it so hard to do what is necessary, which is consume art from morally compromised people. First of all, we're all morally compromised, except for you, Inez. But otherwise, it's impossible. Like, it's not to say you have to be a bad person to be a good artist, but a whole lot of good artists are really bad people, and we're not going to throw their art out of the public square, and we shouldn't, because people don't want to advertise their products on it. And obviously the subscription model is booming right now for a reason, but at the same time, it's just unhealthy to say you can't. We're imposing these impossible tests. We have no way of knowing what happened with Russell Brand. We do know that he's very clearly said that was, he got sober and et cetera, et cetera. We all sort of knew that's who he was. We're not coming to him for advice on how to live a sexually pure life. That would be absurd. People watch his show for his heterodox take on politics. So should Rumble be able to make money off of that? Yes. Rumble has to be able to make money off of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the matter that these, because there's a larger question I'm not even going to dig into, because I've been, going back and forth on it in my own head for, I think, at least 20 years about morality and art. But the specific matter of Me Too allegations, especially many years later, part of what bothers me is the idea that, and this is another polyism, because she's the woman of the age, clearly. But look, putting aside cases of very clear enforceable rape, right? Put those in one category. She's like, basically, we have spent the last couple decades adjudicating what are essentially gray area cases, he said, she said, cases in which there is a tangle of motivations, sometimes, self-rationalization. You have the simple matter, even if everybody's being honest involved, right? The simple matter that, what someone feels internally is not necessarily what they project externally. And the question is, would a reasonable or decent person, have interpreted correctly, the signals that a woman is giving? And then if you layer on top of all of that, female sexuality is not compatible in many ways with giving clear instructions like that. And I know that that's whatever. I don't know why that's even remotely controversial to say. It's so obvious that, there's nothing more at odds with female sexuality than, for example, laying out
clarity.
With clarity and no plausible deniability exactly which sex acts with which men she is willing to do. Like, this is such a idiotic and obviously incompatible with the actual, dynamics of any of this that is going on. And I know that, look, if you get drawn as a pool, jury pool for something like this, it's difficult enough. And I know that many women do not get justice in court exactly because it's very difficult to hash out after the fact what happened in one of these private moments with two different people in their own heads with, 1,000 motivations of each, right? Unless it is that clear case of forcible rape. And so I understand that means necessarily that there are probably women who were in the right and could not get justice, right? I just accept this as part of the world. But the idea that now we're going to pretend that these things are clear cut and that we, the public, from limited and biased information, unlike what you would get in a courtroom where there are strict rules about what evidence comes in and what evidence doesn't come in, although I would bracket here, those rules changed dramatically in the 1970s just with regard to sex and sexual assault cases, right? And we can discuss whether that was a good idea, but the rules of evidence, even in court, are looser, or in some cases stricter. They favor the woman more, or the accuser more, than like, let's say you're accusing somebody of just pure assault as opposed to sexual assault. They actually favor the victim more in court. So we're saying we already have somewhat of a rigged system in court, for the accuser. But still, there are rules about what kind of evidence can come in, right? The jury has to decide, based on actions after the fact as well, which is so often a case with these college cases, right, where the girl continues going out with the guy after the alleged rape for the next, year and a half, and then when they break up is when she decides that to bring the case. Like, all of these relevant facts can be, to the extent possible in a human system, adjudicated in a courtroom. The idea that 20 years later, in these kinds of extremely gray cases, we're going to all sit in public when we know that the reason that this guy was selected, and I don't care about the politics of Russell Brand, I never found him particularly compelling, right? But like, we know that the reason he was selected now and not 10 years ago when he was actually doing these things is because his politics has changed, right? I don't know.
Oh,
It just seems like there's a lot of dishonesty going on, and we're all supposed to pretend that entire background of the opaqueness of female sexuality to begin with, the fact that these are decades ago, the fact that it's obviously that he's a political target, the fact that the media is going for it, the fact, all of what you brought up about the fact that this has been an excuse to just bring down the censorship hammer on what he's been saying that's been unrelated to any of this, right? I don't think all of that adds up to any possibility of finding out what happened between Russell Brand and this list of women 20 years ago. I resent being roped into the task of trying to do that. It's impossible.
it kind of reminds me of how Maureen Dowd and other women reacted to Bill Clinton exploiting, and you and I might disagree over whether what he and Monica Lewinsky did amounts to exploitation. I think it's the power dynamic there is kind of unavoidably exploitive, but I will say how Maureen Dowd reacted to that, and many other feminists at the time, was basically, he's a good president, so what? And that's a kind of different can of worms, but in a sense this does remind me of that reaction, because it's this idea, like, they see people as kind of blunt force political objects or cultural objects, and when they no longer become useful, the sort of gatekeepers of culture will figure out how to give them the boot. And Russell Brand, how many people, I mean, there are stories of him being mocked during BBC shows, and not wanting to take the mockery over this, allegedly, not too long ago. But this seems to have, again, been a quote unquote open secret in Hollywood. And of course it was, because he talks about it. And so why is it that 10, 20 years ago, everyone in Hollywood was still flinging doors open to Russell Brand, and they are now sort of eagerly closing those doors? Is it because their sexual mores and standards have changed? I just don't think that's the case. I think it is all about superficial signaling, how they appear in public, as opposed to how they actually think about some of these things. And that is, for that to be the standard, then that changes our ability to have important conversations, to hash them out in artistic forums and political forums, is absurd. It's not a good, I mean, it's not a sound, consistent argument, but it feels like it's the one that's winning because they control all of the levers of power.
Well, and Woody Allen can't find a distributor for his new movie, which has, as far as I know, nothing to do with his sexual escapades, unlike some of his other movies.
And actually, you know what? And it's like, you and I have disagree on your co-host Richard, and I am so glad that they still published his book, that his publisher still went on with his book. I found that to be a very heartening sign, and I think it's one that wouldn't have happened just a couple of years ago. And so, like, it's true, there's a tug of war going on right now, but the idea that people who have what you consider really bad ideas shouldn't have access to platforms. All that does is let things fester and metastasize in the shadows instead of being exposed to. If you think that you have the sunlight, expose it, and maybe you don't have the sunlight, and maybe the other person does, and we can all make our decision, because that's how we've decided to do things in the West, is to hash these things out as political bodies, as social bodies.
Yeah, I mean, I guess two things. One, Richard wrote an interesting postmortem on cancellation and failed cancellation, I think it's fair to say at this point. And where he said it basically, it's bifurcated, right? Where the right is finally hardening up to these cancellation attempts to the extent that, even something that, like I think even Richard would describe, like his former, some of his former writings as like far beyond the pale. And not only that, I think he would describe them as stupid in some ways. But I don't know. To me, this is crucial to the understanding of the right. And I've now been, I guess, the one of several defenders of the three people canceled in a row for these kinds of things: Pedro Gonzalez, Richard Hanania, and Nate Hochman. Right, Nate being the least fair of the three by far. He did, by the way, Nate did not make that video with the Nazi symbol. He merely retweeted it and didn't realize what it had at the end. I mean, I'm not sure. I wouldn't. We'll get to World War II in this episode, by the way, because there are some people who really don't know much about World War II. But the symbol at the end, like, yeah, it seems vaguely fascist, but like, I don't know that I would have immediately made that association either.
I didn't know what the Stalingrad was.
Yeah,
I didn't know what it was. Anyway,
I feel like I know a fair bit about World War II, and I didn't know what it was either. I had to be told, right? So his is by far the least fair of those sort of cancellation attempts. But even when it involves actual stuff that I deeply disagree with, I think the right has to harden up to this stuff. You cannot, pull the trigger on command on people. And furthermore, there's this fear of talking to people with radical politics that just doesn't exist on the left at all. Nobody has ever been canceled for having, for example, a college fascination with Stalin, or a continuing fascination with the politics of communism and Stalin, like your co-host.
He likes to put the book of Lenin. We each got to bring our own, as the producers described, knickknacks to the new set, and he likes to put the book of Lenin so that it's always resting like just above my head. Lenin is just like floating over me in the shot.
Lenin is your sword of Damocles on the show.
Yes, exactly.
He's just gonna to execute you as a kulak. No, but I just as an aside, that's sort of, I think this conversation is probably more relevant than the point I'm going to make, but I don't know. It's a good test case, the Monica Lewinsky thing, right? Because on the one hand, to the extent that one cares about power dynamics, there's no clearer potential for that kind of power dynamic abuse than the president of the United States and a 22-year-old intern, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, that is almost certainly exactly what she found hot about it at the time. And she was an adult. So there's no way to separate that kind of power dynamics and many of these other dynamics that the left has declared forbidden from sex, period. And if you do, you end up with like no sex, which is, I guess, what Gen Z is having. But I don't think there's a way to separate that dynamic. Now, do I think it can be abused? Of course. But like those abuses are generally not straightforward. Usually they're complicated and like psychologically sometimes devious, like it just... You might be able to know what happened between your friend and her boyfriend because you had a front row seat to it. You will never know what happened between, two people 20 years ago in a hotel room when one of them's a celebrity. By the way, do you think that these women did not know Russell Brand's reputation at the time. That's probably why they were excited that he was hitting on them, because he was a celebrity who was known for, what was the award he got? Like, he had, screwed his way through all of the British Isles. He
There's
got
an
some
award for
award
that?
from yeah, like the most shagged award or something. They
I think
literally gave him
Lennon
an
also
award
got
for
that
banging
award.
women.
I think Lennon
Yeah.
also got that one.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
No,
a little history joke.
I think blood got him off more, but anyway.
They did think that he had syphilis, though. That is a theory.
Well, actually, let's talk about World War II, because this is actually relevant.
Let's take a hard pivot from Russell Brand to World War II.
Yeah.
Well, Donald Trump did say that. What did he say? AIDS was his Vietnam. His personal Vietnam.
Yeah, I remember that song by Pink in the early 2000s called Vietnam, which was basically that, like, my relationship is my Vietnam.
Huh. I was unaware of that song, but I'm glad.
I'll send it to you. It's probably before your time, Emily.
It's a little young.
No, but so the reason that I am thinking about World War II is there's this now, this just layers and layers of stupidity. This story that broke a few days ago, because the Canadian Parliament invited, along with Zelensky, I assume he traveled with the Zelensky's delegation. He's a national hero for Ukraine from World War II, which immediately anybody who knows anything about the battle lines there would say, well, yeah, maybe you should check that this guy wasn't a Nazi. And it turns out that he was, and not only was he allied with the Nazis, he was like an SS. He was in an SS detachment. Yeah. So the first layer of stupidity, of course, is like that nobody thought to check this before. Like, you just take Ukrainian hero from 1944, and you didn't check anything about why he's being called a hero. But then there was this second layer of stupidity on top of it in the discourse, which I saw, a bunch of people on the right, sort of pile on and say, well, like, how can we ally ourselves with Nazis? Like, this is horrible. And had absolutely no understanding of what happened in that region. I mean, there was a 5-way bloodbath, at least 5-way bloodbath in that kind of swath of territory that's rightly called the Bloodlands, between, the German army, the Red Army, right? And then Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, some smaller ethnicities also. And then it's a story that played out also to some extent in the Baltics. Look, it was a extremely disturbing and bloody history there, in which most people took their turns being victims and victimizers. Most people took a turn before, in front of, and behind the gun, and there were many allyships made. I mean, you're talking about a Ukraine coming off the Holodomor, where they were intentionally starved by the millions, to the point of family cannibalism. And the idea that it's crazy that they would ally with Nazi Germany against their Soviet oppressors is also just like completely lacking in history. And then there was the final layer. I'm sure we'll get to 3 other idiocies with this story before it burns out. But then I saw like the libs sort of defending themselves for clapping for an SS officer by saying, well, Canada and the United States firebombed Dresden. So really, aren't all sides equally war criminals?
Is that why Operation Paperclip was trending? I saw that Operation Paperclip
Yes.
was trending on Twitter, and I was like, I am turning this off for the day.
Yes. And the relevancy of all of this, I think, does go back to, I don't know if you remember when not Oprah, I'm going to get dragged for confusing this, Whoopi Goldberg because I think Oprah said something similar several years ago, by the way, but Whoopi Goldberg saying that the Holocaust wasn't about race because it was 2 groups of white people, right?
Yes.
And people calling her anti-Semitic, which is not true. She's just being an idiot. But it's trying to apply this very 2023 stupid understanding of race and of who the bad guys are. And I'm starting to wonder if both the American left and right can conceive of any evil that isn't Nazis. Like the understanding of the level of evil coming from the other side of the continent. There were 2 monsters grappling on the European continent, not just one. And I'm not even disagreeing that the U.S., as though some historians do, should have allied itself with Uncle Joe during that war. But no, you answer me this, Emily. Why is it that the American understanding, contemporary American understanding, is so heavily weighted towards the only thing that people know is that Hitler was a bad guy, right? There's like no understanding that there were other bad guys involved, even in World War II, and that but why is it that there is no cultural understanding of what the Soviet Union did either during World War II or before that? Why is that history so impossibly opaque or buried in America, to the point where nobody knows anything about it unless you're like a crazy person or a nerd or think about the Roman Empire 1,000 times a day. Um, so like, why is that history completely lopsided? Is it just because we let the communists, we should have gone further with Joseph McCarthy? But what happened? Why is it that nobody knows this, that Stalin was a bad guy? Also,
I was gonna say it's because we have like a very American centric version of World War II that we tell ourselves, but that's not right. And in that sort of American centric story, of course, you would necessarily talk less about the Soviet Union, given our alliance with the Soviet Union. So it would sort of be logical. But the reason that can't be right is because we also so often lose sight of the evil that was fought in Asia, in the Pacific. We never, I mean, people don't know about Tojo. Like, we don't even, we have so little concept of the atrocities committed by Japan. And some people would say it's because we, committed the mother of all atrocities by, dropping atomic bombs on Japan. So we necessarily give Japan some sort of pass in our moral imaginations because we just don't want to sort of pick at that scab. But I actually don't think that's true because the scale of the atrocities committed by the Japanese in the years leading up to World War II and during World War II, there is so much there. I genuinely think it has to be this strange, like, American. Is it American guilt? I mean, that's the question. Like, that we were in an alliance with the Soviet Union and we bombed Japan, that we don't want to talk about these two other so very obvious examples. Or like, even think about Che Guevara. How many people were walking around with Che Guevara shirts? Is it because we're embarrassed by the CIA, which I think in many cases we should be, to the point where we don't want to talk about Che Guevara? Why did Obama feel perfectly comfortable going to Cuba? I don't know if it's just the sense of American guilt, which is obviously rooted in some real concerns, but also maybe is preventing us. Like, Hitler is the one enemy from our perspective that America's alleged and serious evils, moral failings, just nothing stacks up on the moral scale to Hitler. Therefore, it's the easiest, most obvious source of our understanding of foreign evil, what it's like to face up to a foreign enemy that embodies evil, that it's what we're comfortable with. I don't know. That's sort of also just conjecture.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting explanation that I hadn't thought of, the like sort of self-guilt. But there is just a plain ignorance here. Like, it's certainly true that culturally Americans regard the swastika with 10 times more fear and hate than they do the hammer and sickle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really justified by the historical facts. Not saying either one is, we can have an argument. Where would you prefer to live, in Nazi Germany or Stalin's USSR? I mean, depends on your ethnicity, really.
Aren't you both ethnically
Really?
Jewish and Slavic?
Mm-hmm.
So you're the perfect person
Yeah,
to answer this
half
question.
and half.
The perfect person to answer.
No. Anyway, but Americans just don't regard, like, what you're talking about with the Che Guevara shirts that was everywhere when we were growing up, right? Like, it
Was that
was
Urban Outfitters?
celebrities, yeah, like printed on And there were some, I remember there were like some sort of libertarian leaning conservatives at the time were like, this is the triumph of capitalism. Even Che Guevara's
Yes.
shirt gets slapped on a t-shirt and sold for $300. But I actually think that view is very short-sighted. The fact that, you know, we can celebrate mass murdering communists, but I mean, think about the comparable reaction, right? If someone who has Goebbels on a shirt,
Mm-hmm.
or like, it's I'm not saying it should be illegal or anything like that. I mean, it's just like the cultural reaction against one versus the other, as though they are these wholly incomparable things, is not warranted, and then leads to this kind of stupidity that is where you are shocked to discover that Ukrainian partisans would ally with anyone against the Soviet army, you know, and against the Red Army, and against, like, it just blows my mind. I'm sorry. This is probably just more of a personal rant, because I just can't stand to watch all of these people clash. And even the right on this, on Ukraine, somehow jumps right back into the position of the left, saying, like, you know, it's evil if nationalism is evil, right? Like, Ukrainian nationalism is the one nationalism that the right thinks is evil and the left thinks is fantastic. And all of this reference back to World War II with very little actual historical basis or understanding, as though there were like two sides in World War II that were lined up like little, you know, there was the big bad Hitler, and then there were all of the people fighting for freedom and liberty. There were, and I'm not actually knocking that with regard to the West, and with regard to the UK and America. But, you know, speaking of Poland, like, Poland was invaded from two sides by two different monsters at the start of the war.
And neither of them was America.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, yeah, like, that's the cherry on the sundae at the end. Oh yeah, isn't America and Canada, aren't America and Canada just as bad as these two 20th century monsters, both responsible for millions upon millions of horrendous and ugly deaths, right? Like, oh no, we're bad because we fought back, and we you know, dropped the bomb on Japan, and we dropped some firebombing on Dresden. Like, that's supposed to make us the great moral evil. There's absolutely no moral clarity at all. More this stupid moral equivalent. Sorry, I really am ranting now, but I hate to see, when I'm scrolling down my timeline, and it seems to happen just as often from the right now as it does from the left, this kind of morally simplistic analysis where there's a single pole of badness. And you know, another good example of this is when people were talking about Putin. And this is to still this day, Christopher Caldwell is such a smart guy. He's written so many smart things, but he wrote something so impossibly stupid that I don't understand how somebody so smart could write it, which is, he has this sentence in a long praising of Putin in 2017 saying, well, Vladimir Putin is not a feminist NGO.
Was this in Claremont?
No, actually it was in Imprimis.
Okay.
Like, as though those are the two poles of good and bad, right? Like,
Right.
either you're with Globo Homo, or you're bad, or you're Vladimir Putin must be good because he's not a feminist NGO from, you know, the West that is endorsing transing the kids around the world. Like, these are the two types of people in the world. Like, there's only a single. It's like a unipolar, and the left has the same thing with Nazis, right? It's a unipolar bad type. You are good insofar as you are not a Nazi, and bad insofar as you're, like, there's no recognition that one could be against Nazis and also, for example, be a mass genocidal murderer.
Mm-hmm. Like, and we were mentioning earlier how Operation Paperclip is trending on Twitter, which is obviously about rat lines and the integration of former Nazis into the U.S. kind of military apparatus, the space program. And that, to me, seems to confirm what we're talking about, in the sense that the left is actually trying to muddy the waters on the U.S. and Hitler. And for the left, it's like everything has to come back to some sort of American evil, as opposed to just sort of being able to, and by the left, I mean, like, that's an attempt by sort of the fringe left. And I would say, when it came to Che, obviously Motorcycle Diaries was nominated for an Oscar. I think it actually won an Oscar when it came out.
I remember that coming out.
that it was successful. And I think this is like a similar attempt. It's just not one that's been mainstream for a number of reasons, that it's much more complicated, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think there is this, Americans are so receptive because we were founded with this idea that we're striving to be a more perfect union. So rather we so easily lose sight of the fact that that's a process, because we are striving towards perfection. We are trying to perfect the system of self-government. And so when we fall short of that, we're extremely sensitive about it. And I think that some of these things have been mainstreamed. This like nuance gets papered over, because for us, often we are so receptive to the idea that the most important thing is our moral failing, because we're the people who are supposed to be a cut above. And I was thinking as you're talking that Michael Knowles, somebody who I love Michael Knowles, he tweeted today something like, I'm beginning to believe that Joe Biden is more evil than Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And he was talking about Douglas Mackey. I think Christina Pastraw responded to him and said, like, you wouldn't be able to tweet this in Russia, something to that extent. And he said, well, Douglas Mackey is facing a decade in prison for a meme. And that's true. And none of this is to say that we couldn't easily turn into something really scary. I think we part of the reason you and I do what we do is to prevent that from happening, because, power in the hands of bad people can go in a horrible direction. And hopefully our system of government is the best bulwark that has ever been invented to prevent that from happening. But that to me just is an impossible math problem. Like that, there's just no way. I think you can get from those two to Joe Biden, as bad as I think Joe Biden is. I just don't know what the point of even making that comparison is. And Michael, if he were here, would have a very articulate and smart response, and we'd have a fun debate. But I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, it's the moral equivalency is silly. But even these comparisons are not. There's the idiocy about the 20th century itself, which is now playing out, and what we've been talking about. But I think the reason the comparison that Michael's making is, in my view, wrong is not only because of the moral equivalence, which is a dumb moral equivalence. Clearly, we might get pretty bad or pretty tyrannical, but we are not yet. I don't even want to say on air what the kind of things that the Red Army was doing as it was pushing west, or obviously what the Nazis did to their own Jewish population and other subhuman populations,
or what the Japanese did to
or what the Japanese did in Nanking.
Yep.
So there's no moral equivalence to that, I don't think. That's one reason it's wrong, but the more practical reason I find it wrong is because it's not helpful to think in 20th century terms about tyranny. Because the shape of the system is very different, even though the outcomes are sometimes similar, right? So the Woody Allen thing is a really good example. So Woody Allen's new film is not found a distributor in the United States. It will not be shown in the United States. It's being shown in Europe. It's opening in Europe now. But if you are an American, you cannot watch Woody Allen's film. That is the end result. Now, apparently, somebody sent me there's some like half legal streaming service online where there are sort of technological workarounds.
It's like how we watched Louis C.K. I Love You, Daddy.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah, so that's another example, right? But the shape and how it got there is very different. It's this private collusion that's now being revealed with Missouri v. Biden and everything else, that has plenty of tendrils coming from government, from government agencies, but also has this very strong private component. It has a coordination component. It's not necessarily top-down marching orders, but rather allegedly or superficially independent actors acting together because of shared background understanding, without the need to directly coordinate much of the time, like these distributors, right? They all understood Woody Allen's been MeToo'd. We can't distribute his movie. All of us understand this. We don't need a government to suggest it, right? And it would be not only the wrong sort of leaving aside leaving aside mass genocide and that moral equivalence, it would be wrong even on this limited issue of censorship, right? The end result is the same. My father grew up not being able to see most Western movies unless they made it through the communist censors, and we're fortunately sometimes stupid and let through some good movies. But um, like that's the end result, and you could say the end result is the same. But if you don't understand that these are two different systems, the response that you have in fighting it is going to be radically different, perhaps diametrically opposite. I don't know, so in that sense, I feel like the equivalence is also not just morally wrong, but also it's not helpful for where we are right now to imagine the comparison, for example, of direct censorship in the Soviet Union, of movies.
That's
We have
interesting.
to think about is it because we've bottlenecked the distributor? I don't know anything about the distributor industry, to be clear. Is it because we've bottlenecked that there are too few actors that they can so easily coordinate like this?
Yes.
Is it
Yes.
because they have the same background, culturally the same background, right? That they all went to the same schools and so on, and then there's a long rant about what we've allowed our education systems to become. How did it happen that these people with plenty of market share and power all ended up thinking exactly the same way about this one movie? Like, that is a very different problem than we have an overbearing government that doesn't want us to see a Woody Allen movie and is therefore taking it off the shelves. Like, the way you address
Yes.
that problem is very different than the way you would address the former problem that actually exists in the United States. And so conflating them is not necessarily helpful, even though I think there's some benefit sometimes to make a limited comparison. But in the same way that it's not helpful to like imagine that Ukrainian partisans were joining Nazis because they wanted to participate in the Holocaust, although many of them were anti-Semites. Like, that's not a helpful construct, because it actually has no contact with the actual life and challenges faced by being a Ukrainian in 1944,
Mm-hmm.
sitting in that piece of land. Like, it doesn't have any contact with reality to describe it that way. And it doesn't have much contact with reality to describe the United States as having a similar censorship, for example, regime as the Soviet Union. It's not going to lead you to anything productive to think about it that way, I don't think.
Yeah, no, that's interesting on the narrow question of censorship too. Because Michael brought it to Mackey, and I don't know exactly what he meant in the broader sense by those comparisons. I mean, maybe he meant because America is supposed to be better, that it's even worse that Joe Biden is failing. I don't know. But on the censorship point, I think that is a really interesting question, because to a lot of people on the left, what you just described about bottleneck studios, comprised of people who all went to the same schools and thought the same way, would sound a whole lot like the McCarthy era, when there was like pressure on Time magazine from the CIA, and the CIA was actually doing covert propaganda operations in ways that are actually like mind-boggling to think of. Like, the origins of the Paris Review go back to the CIA. I mean, like, this stuff was very intentional, and the scope of it was vast. And I think to have made an overtly, what would have at the time been politically incorrect, anti-American movie, or pro-communist, pro-Stalin movie would have basically been impossible. And so the left would look at that as almost quaint, that the right is now sort of concerned about these things. But what I would say to that is, we resolved those problems without shedding blood. And that's incredible. And that puts us in a better position than those countries. The cultural revolution that Mao explicitly waged in China, even if you look at how Xi Jinping is enforcing cultural conformity in Xinjiang, like down to people's clothing and hairstyles, what they read, all of those things, we resolve those in different ways. When Putin wanted to take Crimea, that is not how we resolve things within our own country. And people can make arguments about our involvement in Crimea, or maybe that we're complicit in Xinjiang. But the bottom line is that we have a system that when there's a consensus developing that we are failing in some way, we are striving and successfully in more cases than not to correct those. And we do have the freedoms as of right now. That isn't to say they aren't precious and taken for granted, and as I think a lot of people have recognized, but we do have those freedoms, and nobody has ever lived like that before on this scale. So I'm with you, Inez. I think it's the headline is that it's remarkable.
People are always conveniently forgetting that politics is just the slightly more appetizing version of violence. Like it's a slightly better substitute for violence, without which, if we cannot resolve things through a mutually legitimized political system, the resort is violence between people. This is not something we like to think about, and there's a bit of, and especially I think those of us in our generation, of the end of history generation, don't want to think about that, but that's fundamentally what it is. And this is why sometimes I think, some parts of the left are are hopelessly naive in terms of they're very aware of how to apply power, but they have so little understanding of the possibilities of pushing people to the wall. And this is that they are constantly going on about, white supremacy or whatever in the United States and the domestic terror threat, and the reality is they must not take these things very seriously, because they continue to push people so far into a corner, that it speaks well, of the country and of the traditions that you've been referencing, that it hasn't produced such, a huge wave of violence, because that's the underlying condition of mankind, and not just of evil old white men constantly demonized in America. They're actually rather tolerant, all things considered. But of all peoples, everywhere, and the consequence of breakdown of politics is violence. Yeah, that's not pleasant to think about. But speaking of politics being just slightly more pleasant than war, I want to close this out briefly by talking about something political directly, which is this two-part thing. So Gavin Newsom in California has vetoed this gender ideology bill, this parental rights bill, that was pushed by his own side, by the left, and this has brought some speculation that he's running. And then there's also, just today, as far as I saw it anyway, there was the announcement that Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis are going to have a debate on Fox, a debate of governors, which is sort of like what our politics would be like on Earth 2 if we didn't have Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and the stampeding army of geriatrics who runs our country.
You saw the New Yorker cover?
I did see the New Yorker cover. I thought it was funny.
Depicted exactly as a stampeding army of geriatrics. You see Dave Feinstein, Mitch McConnell, Trump, Biden, etc. Just describing for anyone who didn't have the privilege yet.
Yeah. So what do you think? Do you think that the left is going to throw over Joe for Gavin? What do you think? How do you think that changes the race? Do you think? Do you look forward to this kind of debate between governors? Do you think it will have any impact, or is it just going to be like the last GOP debate, which was basically like a bunch of people vying for vice president, and it was kind of like watching the JV league?
In totally unrelated news, Jimmy Carter, who has been in hospice care for about a year, was spotted at some sort of peanut festival in Georgia this week. And that is my way of prefacing this revelation which is two things keep me on edge every day about American politics is the possibility that at any moment I could get a push alert that, and I mean this seriously, the president of the United States has passed away in office. And secondly, I could get a push alert that he's decided to step down. I think actually it's much less likely that he steps down than something horrible and incapacitating takes place, or definitively incapacitating takes place. But those things could literally happen at any moment of the day. And I do think Gavin Newsom is banking on that, banking that something happens. And I actually think also people in the official Democratic apparatus are encouraging him because they're also banking on that. So to create a sort of shadow candidacy that if something does happen in Biden world, he is perfectly positioned to step into the void. I think that's something that Joe Manchin was thinking about too. I don't know if he's actually going to launch his third party no labels bid. I don't know whether or not Gavin Newsom's sort of shadow candidacy makes that more or less likely. I'd have to think about it a little bit. But the Gavin Newsom shadow candidacy, I think, is very much attached to official Democratic circles, where you have even David Ignatius writing for the Washington Post that Joe Biden is too old for the presidency, which is a remarkable turn of events in Washington, D.C. Somebody the president is known to read, that the White House pays close attention to, an establishment columnist like Ignatius writing that is the equivalent of a political earthquake in any other time period. But it was sort of just like a drop in the ocean because of this media cycle right now. So I think what Newsom is doing is hedging his bets. I think the Democratic establishment is hedging their bets. I think they want to show Joe Biden that there's an option that could maybe be the thing that breaks the camel's back, is him looking and saying, yes, I have a capable successor. And if I step down at this point, the Democratic Party is going to be just fine, because that neo-Rooseveltian track that I put the country on will be steered capably by Gavin Newsom. If they can show him that, maybe it makes it more likely that he and his family feels okay with him stepping down. And then if something does, God forbid, happen to the president while he's in office, Newsom is well positioned just to fill the void right away. And there isn't this consternation and this really difficult period of trying to figure out who the heir apparent is, because he's been casting himself literally as the heir apparent by sitting across from Ron DeSantis in debates. I think it's always good to debate. There's a great, I think you probably agree with this, Ben Domenech wrote years ago a criticism of the sort of Beltway media consensus that it was just so wonderful when Jon Stewart, legendarily destroyed Crossfire and just took down Tucker Carlson, and I think it was Paul Begala at the time, in one fell swoop on the show, saying that they're destroying America. And Ben's argument is that that was a really negative thing, because we should want public debate as much as is possible, theatrical or not. We should want public debate. We should want gloves off, regular public confrontations between all sides of our politics. And so I think it's sort of funny that Gavin Newsom is doing this, and Ron DeSantis isn't the front runner, so it's interesting. But I can only say I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that debate would have a lot more contact with the actual concrete options before America, right?
And probably the preferences of regular Americans.
There are two models going forward: the California model and the Florida model.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that actually, those are, in terms not only of policy, which I realize no one cares about, but in terms of like actual quality of life, those are the two models for the country. And so, yes, I mean, I agree. I think it's a good thing, even if it's sort of disconnected from the presidential debate. I mean, I think that in itself is a commentary on our politics, and I think that's something that you've written, I think, so intelligently over and over again about, is we have this one layer of our politics that isn't actually digging into a lot of the things that make or break, comfortable life for Americans, or the life that they've been used to expecting. Whether that's, the deaths of despair and addiction rates and life expectancy going down, whether that's the quality of our food, which I'm totally convinced now is the culprit for the obesity crisis in America.
What about also the
Um,
anxiety and depression crisis too?
right.
Let's go.
Everything. The way we've reacted to the pandemic, right? That the fact that we have an entire generation that is essentially completely atomized, that doesn't interact in real life, is less likely to have had a beer or have a driver's license. Or I actually think that's a big deal. I'm sure there are people out there laughing, saying like that's not that important. I actually think it reflects something deeply important about life and the quality of American life. And it strikes me that these two models, California and Florida, are a better proxy for the future of our country in a way that both Biden and Trump, to some extent, were not good proxies for what their administrations have done.
That's
Right?
brilliant.
So
I think that's really true.
Like Biden's administration is extremely culturally left wing, has done all kinds of crazy crap. And I can give you a list a mile long, starting with Title IX. But Biden himself presents as sort of a moderate labor Democrat. And people really think that's who he is, because they see him a couple times and they're like, okay, maybe the guy's a doddering, geriatric, but sort of a moderate labor Democrat. They don't understand that his administration has done all kinds of culturally radical things that they would disagree with. And similarly, Donald Trump ran as breaking the mold for Republicans, but the two biggest achievements of his domestic administration, right, are tax cuts and deregulation, which is very much the Mitt Romney agenda.
And by the way,
I'm not against the Mitt Romney agenda, by the way. I just think in terms of priorities, I have different priorities, but I don't think it's a bad outcome. But to match sort of what's coming out of Donald Trump's mouth with what his administration is doing, there's a mismatch there in a way that, like, California versus Florida is an actual representation of what it's like to live under Democrats and what it's like to live under Republicans.
Right. And I was going to say, we would not dispute that properly implemented tax cuts and deregulation is bad for the working class. And in fact, I think you and I would both agree that properly executed, those two things would boost the material circumstances of the working class. Again, properly implemented.
They did under Trump. There was
exactly.
a blue collar increase in real purchasing power.
But at the same time, parents end up, working class parents who are Christian and can no longer send their kids to the public school because they're worried about, for very real reasons, very material concerns about their child's well-being if they send them to a public school. Not just these sort of abstract questions of values, which are important, but like actual their physical well-being if they send their kid to a public school. And one day a teacher says, "Oh, I'm relaying part of a real story. Are you transgender? Okay, start using this bathroom," and starts that kid down this long, long path towards short-term misery and likely long-term misery. That comes right out of that parent's pocketbook. That is immense stress. That is emotional pain. And so if you ask that parent whether they would rather have a tax cut or something that would let them send their kids to a public school, to have a public school that is creating a community they're proud of and can trust in, I think a whole lot of them, maybe not all of them, I think a whole lot of them would prefer a legislative priority from a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate that deals with these questions. And that is one of the things that the sort of official Republican world continues to misunderstand and to communicate about poorly. And your point about these two, I want to ask you a question, actually, because you're from California. I think these two examples are exactly accurate. I shouldn't say exactly, but are fairly accurate representations of these two worldviews being implemented on a serious state level. And I think when you put them side by side, it is beyond obvious which one is in which place is better to live. And I think, Americans are voting with their feet in that sense. And, aside from the very clear quantitative metrics, that just seems very obvious to me. On the other hand, I think a lot of Californians, even wealthy Californians, are probably happy to say, yes, I would rather live in California than Florida. I would rather support this welfare state, have compassionate policies, and believe in the full LGBTQ agenda, and feel that my state believes in that too, than live in Florida. I think a lot of them, again, like wealthy people, in fact, they still live there. So obviously they do think that. I think there's some people that are exasperated with it and tired about it. But I think if you asked them side by side, a lot of people would stay in California.
Well, leaving aside, I mean, the fact that moving has its own costs, right? People have family.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think obviously California is the more beautiful state. Has
I
great
think that's
weather.
true. I think that's true.
Objectively, I sometimes wonder what would have happened to California if the weather was like Detroit.
Have you seen LA Confidential?
Love that movie.
So I tweeted the opening to it a couple weeks ago, because the opening to it is all of these advertisements about California, living in California, with this like sort of audio narration about how it's like accessible and beautiful to the middle class, whatever. And it gives me the biggest pang in my stomach about the United States, that like it just makes me almost more emotional than anything about the fate of the country, because California, as Didion has written so eloquently about, was this beacon of American hope and liberty and the pioneer spirit, in the American sort of iconography. All of this comes together in California, and it is now hell on earth. And that sort of Solzhenitsyn question of freedom, I think, is really relevant to the entire state of California.
Yeah, it makes me sad. Like it was, as you're saying, that it was the California dream within the American dream. And that was a dream that was actually very, very associated in a way that I'm sure, some of your counterpoints buddies would like, breaking points buddies would like, with the success of the middle class, with the boom of the American middle class in the 1950s and 60s, with the kind of life that became possible for somebody, oftentimes without many fewer people without a college degree, without higher, sort of learning or training, but somebody who was, dedicated and smart and willing to apply themselves. That the life on a single family income, the nice Eichler house in the Bay Area, that you could provide for a family and a good life, with a two cars in the garage and a chicken in every pot. In California, that was the California dream, and it was very connected to this huge middle class. That's the exact inverse of what California is now. California is a place for the hyper wealthy and the dependent class. There is the middle class in California is being squeezed in every conceivable way that they could be squeezed. They're being squeezed by the taxes and paying for the enormous benefits and welfare state that is so attractive that it attracts literally bums from the entire country.
It's a great place to be homeless until
it is an amazing place to be homeless.
Until you get until you buy a drug that is laced with fentanyl or tranq, then it's not so good because you can't get help.
Yeah, well, and then also, the safety that they rely on, to have those Eichler neighborhoods, is even in some of the nicer neighborhoods now being threatened, particularly by the inability to deal with what are basically overlapping categories of mentally disconnected from reality, and drug addicts on the street. That you must be very wealthy to escape. They've been slammed with the cost of housing, which has been a bit of a NIMBY-esque problem as well. So there's a lot that the housing, crisis in California has many, many antecedents and would take up a whole show to talk about it. And probably I would need to bring someone who knows more. I only know the surface level, but nowhere I've ever lived, including Manhattan, has the level of housing crisis that the Bay Area has, and that California in general has. There are so many people who are commuting 3 hours each way in incredible traffic on roads that are dilapidated and have not kept up with the influx of people to California. There's a demographic element. This is why it's like sort of a microcosm of that's why I say this really is this California versus Florida route, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really represents two directions America can go. To the point where it has ended up now, and I think this is a perfect encapsulation in downtown LA, which is scary in a way that I cannot recall it being in my living memory. Basically, there are these luxury apartment buildings, many of them still in downtown Los Angeles, with very nice glass penthouses. And the people who live in there, what my LA friends are telling me is those buildings are building what they call amenity decks, which is not just, it makes sense. Like a luxury apartment building would have, a garage and a gym, right? That those things make sense, but they are building what are essentially a convenience store and a happy hour bar, place to hang out. Now, this is not new to have a kind of a rec room or whatever, but they're building these very consistently so that you never have to run out and leave your building, because you are actively hunted by the Morlocks below. There's literally the streets of downtown LA are run by insane homeless people. They will follow you and scream at you and harass you in a way that even in East Coast cities I've not encountered, although DC in certain parts comes close. But so these like very wealthy Los Angeles people will live in these glass towers. If they need to run out, to get a glass of wine or to grab shampoo, they can do that all within their building. And then they can go down to the garage, get in their cars, and drive out to an office building in some other park in that garage, go up, make their money, and they never have to interact with basically the disorder on the street, because it has become so dangerous and sad to interact on the street. And I mean, that is the symbol to me of California, is those amenity decks. Same thing with the reason there was the inter-labor sort of inter-left fight about the Google buses in San Francisco, right? Like, there's all this infrastructure built to essentially make it so that the rich people in California can completely separate themselves from the consequences that the middle class has to deal with all the time, let alone the working class, which is basically being driven out by the housing prices 3 or 4 hours out. I mean, they're like Danville around the Bay Area is being built up, right? That would be, when I was a kid, that would be crazy. Gilroy.
Well, Loudoun County in DC, I mean, there's like Microsoft is in like Reston.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's some different dynamics. Virginia still allows building, right? Like, anyway.
For now.
For now, all of this to say is that a state that just, 50 or 60 years ago was literally the dream within the American dream for the middle class has become a place where the middle class cannot culturally, and to add the element that you were talking about sending kids to school where you have no control over what, the quote unquote professionals are doing to your child, up to and including recommending them for life altering drugs and surgery without your consent or even knowledge. So you cannot trust the public schools, right? So that's another aspect of, well, then you need to be able to homeschool or pay for a private school. And people don't have the money to do that unless they're very wealthy. There's just the public services are a disaster. It's a third world country. I was reading this article about San Jose DMV where you have to bribe a Sherpa, basically, to take your application into the DMV. And I'm not speaking literally about Sherpas. I'm saying somebody who piggybacks your application, because there are people who have their contacts at the DMV and you basically have to pay them a bribe so that they will go and talk to their friend and actually get your stuff processed from the DMV. That's literal third world
The Soviet
stuff.
patronage system. Yeah.
It's routing around. The formal system is so broken that you revert to the kind of private bribery system in order to get anything done. The black market is more functional than the real market, right? Anyway, so that's, I mean, to me, that is like the essence of where we're going. It's become impossible, both culturally and financially, in California to, I don't know, raise a family, to live a normal American middle class life. But for both reasons, economic and cultural, in equal measure. And that is, I think that, again, I think that has more contact with the future we can expect if Democrats retain power in their current trajectory in the country. And I think Florida would be it's a well executed. I'm not so sure that Florida is the result of having Republicans in power. That, to me, that would be a best case scenario, in the sense that it's a very well executed and thoughtful Republican agenda. But in Florida, as far as I can tell, yes, they have some problems with housing costs, precisely because everyone is moving there and they're starting to deal with that problem. But where you can rely on the public schools to have some control over what your kids learn, and if not, there are school choice programs to allow you to go somewhere else, where there isn't mass disorder in Miami, where crime is going down or holding steady, where homeless people are not permitted to simply run the entire city. Actually, a Los Angeles friend of mine, who was texting me just today, is like, yeah, if I park, there's like a total two standard of laws, because if I park with my bumper hanging over the curb, by 6 inches, I get a massive ticket. But there are homeless people parked all over the city who haven't moved their cars in months, and nobody is ticketing them.
There's no consequences if you break somebody's window. And I'm talking about DC, like DC, LA, San Francisco. You can break somebody's window, break into their car, and you are more likely to suffer consequences for being misreading one of the 25 parking signs assigned to each spot than actually doing that.
Right. It's again and again since 2020, the thing that just keeps popping up as exactly what describes our situation is Abraham Lincoln in the Lyceum Address, where he basically lays out two groups of people, the chaotic, the lawless, the unproductive citizen, of course, has no love for government or law and order, and senses very quickly when there are no consequences for their behavior. But the way that regimes collapse and governments collapse is actually when the second group of people, who are law-abiding and hardworking and trying to make a living, realize that the government is actually on the side of the anti-socials and not on theirs, right? When they realize that it's not on their side, that they're going to be screwed at every step of the way, that they're going to get a $300 ticket for breaking the minutia of bureaucratic rules that make it impossible to do basic things, but that mass law breaking or shoplifting, just walking into a store and lifting things off the shelves, is going to go unpunished. That person also has no investment in his own government or the stability of his own state, because it's against him and he knows it. And
yeah,
I don't know. That is I think a quite stark difference between the two paths that America can go down. And that's, aside from the presidential debate, aside from the sort of the also apocalyptic stuff that is going on between Trump and Biden, two guys who are either going to win or go to jail. Underlying that is a very, I think, pragmatic and pocketbook level, life quality level comparison between California and Florida.
I think that's such a good point. I hadn't thought about it. And the last thing I'll say is you were quoted in a Federalist story not too long ago that had its origins in a walk that I took in downtown LA, where, yes, there's this sort of detritus and the horrific consequences of falsely compassionate policies everywhere you look that you sacrifice your safety and security at the altar of virtue signaling and poorly thought out experiments, human experiments, essentially. But there was also a sign that caught my attention, basically encouraging people to snitch on each other for hate incidents, not hate crimes, but also hate incidents. And as we looked into it, that was government money. That was, and it was government combined with money from Kaiser Permanente and other corporate giants. It was under the auspices of LA County, though. So it was officially a government snitch line. When you go to their website, it's full of stuff that's BLM friendly, trans friendly. They wouldn't respond to comment requests about how they defined hate. It's pretty clear that it's a snitch line for anybody who doesn't agree fully with the progressive agenda, sponsored by the government and big business. And as you were talking, it just struck me, to your point, that like this combination of cultural leftism and crony capitalism, like with PG&E, for instance, in California, they were held, I think, legally culpable for was it the Paradise Fire? It was one of the ones like 5 years ago, a horrific fire. They because basically the state of California gave them so much leeway because they had so much power, they became unaccountable. Crony capitalism and cultural leftism is the result of any effort to try to organize democratic socialism. I'm sorry, like it is. This is basically the only way that this can go, which means you have high earners with disproportionate power subsidizing miserable lives of low earners. It just like the math doesn't work out at all, and this is what it equals. Like it equals California. You just put that equation on the blackboard. It's just utterly miserable. It's unworkable. And it's a place where elites will dangle you by strings in order to comply, and they're not going to pay you well in the process, no matter how you vote, because they have disproportionate power. So, anyway, all that is to say, I think you're absolutely right, and both of us would come down on the side of DeSantis in that debate, and I think for reasons that the left has not fully grappled with.
Yeah, look, I mean, California is spawning, every time you see somebody in the media who is on the right and is basically completely black-pilled and extremely aggressive in fighting the left, there's a better than average chance that that person comes from California. Right? Stephen Miller, Mike Anton, a lot of the Claremont guys, right? Me, Jeremy Carl, who's been a guest on this podcast, right? I think living under that kind of system in the United States makes the question urgent in a very direct and lifestyle oriented sort of way that is quite apart from abstract politics or what gets covered sort of day to day or superficial list of policies. But what it is like, the quality of life that is possible in California today versus in California in 1960 is unimaginably different. And you see that sadness in the generations of people who have seen, instead of the American dream always escalating up, have seen that the state that they live in has been in a constant process of degradation for the last 30 to 40 years, really. And it's a particularly black-pilling thing, I think, for an American, because American, we always were going up. Life was always getting better and more prosperous and freer. And here we have the exact opposite. So I think it's that's why you end up getting a lot of super black-pilled people out of California. Emily, thanks for joining me for another one of these episodes. This one was extra long. Sorry to our listeners, but
No. You're welcome.
You're welcome for an additional 15 minutes from me and Emily here.
It's our pleasure to serve.
Well, thanks again, Emily. Even though you're not interesting, you managed to be an interesting guest this time. I guess we'll keep you around.
Maybe the nicest thing Inez has ever said to me. Oh, also, you forgot Andrew Breitbart among Californians.
Yes, that's a really good example. So Thanks to Emily, and thanks to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman, including After Dark, is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Those comments, reviews, they really help with the all overseeing algorithm so it'll show this podcast to people who might like it. So please do that. And that's about it for us this week. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.